Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast, episode number 2. My name is Jeff Stebbin, and I'm here with Jim McDonald. We are both strategic identity and access management advisors with Identity's advisory practice. If you're looking for identity and access management talk, you have come to the right place. On this podcast, we talk about a wide range of IAM-related topics. It might be current events, things we see come up during our consulting engagements, or other things that we just think you might find interesting. Hi, Jim. How are you doing?
Hey, Jeff. We're going to talk about an article that we found on infosecurity-magazine.com. I guess that's infosecurity-magazine.com. And it's called Healthcare Organizations Too Confident in Cybersecurity. It was written by Casey Zurisk. I don't want to scare folks away. We're not only going to talk about healthcare organizations. I think the discussion today will be, obviously we're going to talk about this article and we're going to talk about that industry, but the things we're going to talk about are going to be applicable to almost any industry. But the article really pulls out some of the key points that Casey found in a white paper on the LexisNexis Risk Solutions website called the State of Patient Identity Management, and there's a link in her article. So the focus of that article is really on patient portals, and really what the article is implying is that there's a higher degree of confidence in the security controls than is warranted in these patient portals, and that she kind of highlights a few of the statistics that were in the white paper, and there's a good data diagram as well, where the use of multi-factor authentication is kind of low relative to what you would expect on a internet-facing website where critical data that is protected by HIPAA would really be stored. You would expect a much higher use of multi-factor authentication, because the bottom line is passwords need to die, right? I'm probably preaching to the choir to anybody who's listening to this podcast, but we all know the weaknesses in passwords, and a lot of them are because we are humans. We use the same password from website to website. Once one of those websites gets cracked, that and there's a data breach, the users and passwords get dumped and put on the dark web, put up for sale. We've seen some of the prices for standard username and password being super cheap, and pennies per account. So anybody can go out and get these accounts and then just run them through a bot and try to log into your banking website or various other websites that you use. And so multi-factor authentication is a control, while not perfect, and multi-factor authentication can mean many different things. It's still a lot better than passwords. And so the article really goes into that. And Jeff, I know you were going to highlight a few of those statistics that were in that article.
Yeah, I think the thing that jumped at me the first part as I read it is that the cybersecurity folks at these healthcare organizations said that they thought they were pretty confident in their strength of their cybersecurity, but really only like 2/3 of them were using multi-factor authentication. So, I'm not sure if those numbers just don't kind of play out too well for me. If you're more confident about it, I think you'd want to put more MFA in place when it comes to that. But, most of the healthcare organizations are only using username and passwords. 2/3 of them have multi-factor, which is great. Somehow that doesn't jive with me that, people being confident in their cybersecurity, I would think you'd want to have more MFA in place, which is interesting because a lot of them, their budgets are staying the same. So even though healthcare breaches are rising and they've increased year over year, the budget being the same is probably not keeping up with the different types of attacks that are going on. So things like call center fraud, bot attacks, crypto mining, those are all things that happen. And they happen pretty commonly, especially in the healthcare side, for whatever reason. There was one of the statistics I saw there where almost half of healthcare organizations have experienced some sort of crypto mining. I mean, that's a crazy number if you think about it. That it's got to be lucrative, otherwise, the attackers wouldn't be going after it. But there's clearly more work to be doing, within the healthcare side. I understand there's a lot of typical health budget challenges that might be in that space. But if you think about it from a cost, right, it's roughly $400 per user or per patient data that gets stolen. The average number of breaches or number of records that might be taken out, you're probably looking at, $1.5 million, $2 million to recover from that. So that's, it's a pretty expensive, way to try to manage things if you're not putting enough security up front. And I think MFA is a huge part of that. I don't know why it's not standard, for more folks. I understand there's a cost associated with it, but I guess why do you, from your perspective, why do you think MFA is not just a given at this point, given how bad passwords are?
Yeah. And well, one thing I was thinking as you were talking about that, there's a disconnect between the confidence level and what we as practitioners consider to be, basic minimum. Mm-hmm. And I think it probably ties back to a little bit on who was interviewed for the study and do they share that point of view with us. Some people might think, well, MFA is just not a realistic for our users, and they're more thinking about it from the user interface perspective. And heck, as practitioners, we need to balance usability and security too, right? We can't just say it's got to be the most secure every time. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I guess what I'm saying is that it might not be the CISOs of the healthcare organization, of the hospital in this case, that were respondents to the survey, to this, feeding into this white paper. It might be people who are more on the business side and who deal with the complaints of like, hey, I can't create an account, or I don't have the same phone number anymore, so I can't get the SMS. And so they might be thinking that, hey, multi-factor authentication is just not realistic for our user population. We have a lot of people who are, older or sick, and they just don't want to deal with it. So we're not going to put them through that. It's just not realistic. And that's really, I think, become kind of a out of date, to a certain degree, an out of date argument, because I think most people are starting to realize the number of data breaches that are happening is just, the risk is unacceptable. And especially when it comes to healthcare data. But in my experience of working with hospitals, most of the CISOs that I've interacted with, usually the patient portal is not under their operational control, but they do set policies for the organization. So they may set a policy that MFA is required, but a lot of times what I've seen is that there's a carve out that, that requirement is just focused on employees or just focused on administrators. So in other words, they soften the policy because there's so much pressure in the organization to make things more user friendly. And so that's I guess that was, as I was reading the article, I'm thinking these couldn't be CISOs who are confident in username and password as an approach.
Yeah, it's kind of like lowest common denominator security, right? And try and design for the easiest way for people to get access, but unfortunately, user password alone just isn't enough. I wonder if, as the population continues to age, if folks who are maybe in their 20s, 30s, 40s now, as they start to hit the age where they are having to take advantage of more healthcare services, if folks who have grown up on MFA will expect it, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, whatever that may be. Whereas the folks who are using it today that are on the upper end of the range, the age range, didn't really grow up with that. And it's not really second nature to them like it is for, whether they're practitioners or even just, folks who have had more experience with it. I think of things like Apple, right? They have MFA on their iCloud accounts. Whether it's perfect or not is kind of irrelevant to me. They have something, but they've made it easy enough where the vast majority of their users, seem to have it enabled and are taking advantage of it. And I wonder if that will extend to things like patient portals, in the future.
Yeah, I think that look, my dad does not have a smartphone. It's kind of mind blowing, but it's just he doesn't have a place for it in his life. He has an older computer at home. I know other people who have a smartphone and don't have a computer at home. So, and usually the people who have the smartphone and no computer at home are more, you know, in the workforce today still. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think that from my perspective, it's ubiquitous, right? But I'm a technology person, and I have to keep reminding myself that even though I think that multi-factor authentication is simple and using authenticator apps is simple, I think for a lot of people it's not.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you're trying to balance that is certainly interesting. It's just, MFA, all the things kind of should be the motto, but you have to kind of balance that usability with the security, which I get. And I think there's probably some more interesting technologies that are coming down the pipeline that will make MFA easier. I think of things like Windows Hello, right? You can look at your computer and it'll authenticate you. That just became FIDO2 certified, so that'll be interesting to see how Microsoft is able to leverage, the true passwordless experience when it comes to log into Windows. Apple, you can already log in with the Touch ID. Behind the scenes, though, there's still a password somewhere. We've been hearing the passwords dying for years. I don't see it quite yet, but it seems like it's always getting pretty close here, especially over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I've noticed. I'm an iPhone user, so I've noticed when I go and register with a website or an app, Apple will say, "Here, use a strong password." And you look at the password that it's recommending, and it's one that nobody could ever guess.
Right.
At the same time, there are a lot of websites that say we can't accept this password. It goes outside of their password policy. But just assuming that it does go through and you register, now it works with my iPhone, and as long as I have my Apple ID and everything is syncing up with the Apple Cloud, it'll work with my Apple laptop. But if I go to a Windows computer, I'm never going to know that password. I'm never going to be able to log in except within that ecosystem. So it's kind of a partial solution.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a pain in the butt, right? Because you've got to, go into your iPhone, find your passwords. It's buried in the settings. It's not a user-friendly experience. I like LastPass. That's the one that I use. So I have that set up across my iPhone, both my Mac and my Windows and my tablet. And I've made that actually my default password manager for my iPhone and for my tablet, so that everything kind of stays in sync. It's not a perfect solution, but it works, pretty well, good enough for me, at least from a management perspective, to be able to, keep track of the different passwords I'm using for different sites.
I like it too. Everybody who I've ever known who uses it are either technophiles or IT people.
Yep.
So I don't think it's a good solution for to solve this problem for patient portals. But
No.
I do think if, as an individual, you want to put up the best defenses for yourself, it is a good solution.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a little bit of a side topic, but what are your thoughts on social identity and logging into things like a patient portal? Would you consider, if you're a CISO, would you consider allowing people to log in with their Facebook or Google or soon to come, the Apple ID social login?
That's a great topic, and I'd want to rely on it. I think one thing people believe is that Google or Apple or Microsoft, that it's you wouldn't get phished or you wouldn't be able to get hacked. I don't think that's true at all. And I generally find that most of the CISOs or even business people that we work with don't feel like it's a sufficient enough control to use a social provider. So while I think technologically speaking, it's a great solution, I think there are confidence issues in it.
Yeah. Well, especially now with privacy concerns, right? I mean, everyone's concerned about Facebook and, what data you're giving them. Same thing from Google. Apple has tried to stake a claim here, especially recently, about being more privacy focused. But even their OpenID implementation isn't really following, all the standards.
Right.
So there's certainly some things there to think about. from a consumer standpoint, it's certainly easier. I think if I'm given the choice, rather than creating a new account or using a already established credential, I'll typically use more established credential. But I know that I have MFA enabled on that, and that I feel more confident in the security around that, rather than just giving yet another ID and a password to some other database somewhere out there that chances are at some point will become compromised. So I see the balance of it. I mean, I certainly don't see enterprise solutions, inside the firewall, so to speak, taking advantage of social login. But I think it's almost become standard for external facing systems, especially on the consumer side, to have some sort of social login credential. I mean, in addition to security, right, it also offloads the user management component of it behind the scenes.
Right. Yeah, it offloads certain portions of it. I think for a patient portal, I'd like to see it as an option. If I was the patient logging in, I don't have Facebook myself. I got rid of my account a couple of years ago. And I found that pretty limiting in terms of there are a lot of websites that have Facebook as the only social option.
Right.
Usually Google is one of them. And I do have a Google account, of course. So, yeah, a lot of times I'll use that as well. And if that's an option, I generally prefer to use it.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about priorities, because something that comes up quite a bit, right, is what do you do first? Money is typically something you have to be very concerned about when it comes time to budget and resources. So I'm going to propose a scenario here, right? So let's say you're one of these CISOs and you are, let's say, at a hospital, and you do not today have MFA or any type of privileged access management solution in place. Which one are you going to go for first?
That's a good question. So I think the scenario that you're proposing is talking about, I'm the CISO at the hospital, and I have a separate budget for internal, separate from my patient portal, right? Patient portal is something that is generally budgeted outside of IT, or at least outside of information security. So working with my budget, first, and there's a big difference. So I've worked with some very large hospital organizations where they have dozens of locations. I've worked with single location hospitals in the past, and generally speaking, their budgets differ quite a bit, especially for identity and access management or for information security in general. First thing I would always want to do, because it's free, is have good policies, and policies that enforce, HIPAA guidelines and kind of need to know. So I'd want to work within a framework specific to my industry and make sure that my policies align with those industry standards at a minimum, right? And if you're getting pushback, at that point, you need to say, time out. These are things that we are forced to comply with from a regulatory perspective. Within that, you need to have good controls for, knowing who has access to what, having appropriate levels of assurance on login. So that's, whether that's MFA or password, username, password, whatever it is, you need to make sure that you have those highlighted or those accounted for in the policy. And then you need to guard the keys to the kingdom. So identifying what is privileged access and making sure that you have appropriate controls around that. Now, then the question becomes, if you're on a shoestring budget, how do you get in compliance with those policies? Or more directly to your question, is if you're having to choose. Mm-hmm. So I think, when you're balancing that need to secure the data with that tight budget, you need to prioritize. And your question, I think, was, okay, if your two choices were privileged access management and MFA, I would say to start off with, this is a bit of a cop-out answer, Jeff.
I hear it coming.
You hear it coming, right? Because I gave you the big intro. Right. But I think you need to do at least a minimum amount of both. Okay, like, for example, MFA, you need to have MFA for administrative accounts. All right, if people are logging into, say, your Office 365, or into your Google Apps, whatever you're using. It's on the internet, and you're talking about like your top level administrators. I'm sorry, you need to enable MFA for those folks. Okay.
Okay.
On the privileged access management side, I think you also need to have some controls. And here's the thing with MFA and with privileged access management. What would hold you back from just going and doing both? If money wasn't a concern, it would be kind of cultural issues. So with MFA, sometimes it's hard to roll out this new service to all of your users. I mean, we're talking abstractly about quote unquote users. Do these people understand the technology? Do they have a device that can be used as the second factor, or are you going to have to buy keys for them and things like that?
Mm-hmm.
And on the privileged access side, there's users there as well. I mean, you're talking about, vaulting passwords, vaulting service accounts, things like that. But I really do think at, kind of that minimum level for PAM, you need to be vaulting shared passwords. So, ideally you're doing something where you are, nobody knows what the passwords are. I mean, we've worked with clients before where they keep the passwords in a spreadsheet, and encrypted spreadsheet or password protected spreadsheet. But I mean, let's be realistic. If you gave me a copy of a password protected spreadsheet, I'm sure I could find some script that would break it in no time.
Yeah, it's pretty trivial.
It's very trivial. So I think you need to be doing a bare minimum level of each, right? You can go out and find, even if it's the cheapest solution for that password vault, just don't ignore it. And then you need to do MFA for your administrative accounts. Where you get the bang for the buck next, I think, is going to be, you're going to have to look at both those scenarios and say, which of these can I, look, I'm a big proponent of doing your risk and reward analysis. Obviously with PAM, there's a ton of risk in that if somebody fumbles their privileged credentials, you could have a major breach of all kinds of data. But a lot of times the investment to actually go ahead and, properly vault all those passwords, all those service accounts, which, you might not even know what they're being used for anymore. Monitoring administrative sessions, that's a big investment. It's a program. Mm-hmm. On the MFA side, I kind of went over some of the objections that you're run into there. So where's your risk and reward, I think? If you are an organization that has a lot of your services in the cloud, you're using, Salesforce and you're using Workday, I think you get more bang for your buck by doing MFA. If you're an organization that still has most of your assets kind of behind the firewall, I think you probably get more bang for your buck by doing privileged access management and making sure that the guys and gals who have keys of the kingdom, don't really, that you're temporarily issuing access and that you're automatically logging them in. In other words, people don't know the passwords. That's where I think you would get the best value.
I think that's a very logical, well thought out plan of attack. And I think, you cheated a little bit on the answer, but I'm going to give it to you. Judges are giving me a thumbs up. I like the idea of splitting it because you can spend a little bit here and a little bit there and see a major improvement from a maturity standpoint, doing a little bit of both versus trying to focus on just one, which might take you longer. So, I like, definitely admins, people who need the MFA in place and should have it because of the privileges they have. But then also, vaulting those shared accounts, services, those sorts of things makes a lot of sense. So yeah, I totally agree with, what you just laid out.
Thank you.
We're gonna award you a point.
I'll take it. I was going to point out one thing, which is something I brought up in that whole answer, which was, you might get objections from people who don't want to use their smartphone for corporate business because they're paying for their phone. They don't want to install the Microsoft Authenticator app or whatever. And how about you? There's people out there shaking their head like, come on, that doesn't happen.
That happens.
I swear it happens. We run into it, right?
Yeah.
And
there's like this expectation, right? That, well, if the company is making me put this on my phone, then they have to pay for it.
Right.
I don't, there's a lot of different schools of thought of it, obviously, but I don't subscribe to that. I think that if you're being asked to, if you're being given access to something, that you have it within your rights to try and make sure that you're following, proper security guidelines around that, or just don't access it on that device.
Yeah.
But yeah, the whole putting things on phones, that always has kind of bugged me, but certainly happens quite a bit, in all the conversations we have. But then you start to look at other things too, like you can always do things like YubiKeys or, other types of, physical tokens you can hand out.
Yeah, the physical tokens only becomes a real concern when you get into, we need to buy a lot of them, and then we need to have life cycle management for them.
Yep.
And, if we're only going to reserve them for when someone's being a butthead and doesn't want to use their phone, okay, and maybe you're buying 100 of them and it's not that big of a deal. But if you have to buy thousands of them and then manage the life cycle, because people are going to lose them, I mean, that's human nature, then it can be less attractive of a solution. But I where I've really found the objections is when you start talking about workers who are, maybe in like not information workers, not people who sit in an office all day. They're either people who are in a factory, maybe union, maybe not, or people who are in really privacy-driven countries like in the European Union, things like that. That's where I see that objection come up the most. What about you?
Yeah, that's the same thing. It's those regions and those types of workers that typically have those types of issues with it. I think most of the IT people that are out there kind of understand that some sort of virtual token or soft token is going to be part of their life. It's been around, I think, long enough where people kind of understand it. So we certainly see less of that, I think, on the IT side. But yeah, once you get outside the IT world, it's I think there are certainly openings for that. But it's that behavior change, right? It's the culture. I can certainly see companies that have been kind of born in the cloud and have always had some level of security with it, that it just becomes second nature. And yeah, this is just what we do, right? We have this token, and this is how we manage it and how we log in. One of my former roles was responsible for managing RSA tokens. And, we would order hundreds of these at a time for a large organization. And, just the logistics involved of getting them, making sure we had the right ones, making sure we had the CD file. This is how far back this goes, right? The CD with the seed file that you put on the RSA server. Yep. And then getting them shipped out to the right areas and to the right persons, and then them getting it activated. It's just, there's so much work that used to go into, managing a hard token. It's become quite a bit easier, I think, with, some of the more self-service options that are available. But I don't miss that part of that role in one bit.
Well, and I think a lot of the app-based, like authenticator apps, it really just shifts the complexity. It's easier, but it shifts the complexity to the user. So a lot of times you have to download the app, log in with it, and then go and scan a QR code.
Right.
And I just try to picture my dad going through that. I'm like, he could never do that. He would, unless he absolutely had to do it to get like his money or something like that, I think he would just throw in the towel. So it becomes a fallback is like the SMS text.
Yeah, which it's better than nothing, but certainly not the most secure method to deliver, a token.
Correct. The last thing I was just going to bring up on the privileged access side is, some of the objections that you can get there. Usually it's a smaller population of users, but they're very technically savvy, so they can come up with a lot of reasons why it quote unquote won't work. Sometimes you'll be outsourcing a lot of your either network management or server management to a third party, maybe a big outsourcing company. And they may have contractual objections. So again, I'd say start small, vault passwords. That the best would be check in, check out, or automatically log in. But even if you could just implement it and focus on some high risk servers, and then expand, kind of land and expand, if you will. You spread your breadth over time. If you get those contractual objections, eventually the contract is going to have to be renewed. Make sure to get those requirements put into the next contract. Things do change and attitudes do change, especially when you get something up and it's successful and you have internal stakeholders who are saying, this is actually good. It's great. I don't need to worry about remembering my password anymore. Because I think a lot of the objections to PAM start out, they're given as logical objections. Well, what if, it's 2 a.m. and somebody calls me and I don't have access? What am I supposed to do? Call and wake somebody up? And it's like, oh, okay. But behind the scenes, I was a system administrator, so I know it's kind of like you like having that level of access that nobody can look over your shoulder or, stop you from doing anything. I used to be in that role, so I kind of get that feeling of power that you want to maintain. And when that gets taken away from you, you lose that power, and it's not a great feeling. So that might be a little bit behind it, but I feel like, all you can do is win them over by doing a good job. If you don't have the kind of the ability to just drive down, this is what we're going to do, whether you like it or not. And so I'd say get something small started, especially if it's budget driven, and then expand the service over time as you get more budget. You can add more licenses, add more endpoints, and eventually you have a good privileged access program going.
Yeah, I think once you get it started, right, it becomes easier to show the value of it, being able to demonstrate with numbers, right? Here's what we're protecting now. Here's what's not being protected, and being able to justify additional spend by using metrics, is another good way to get things going.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we should probably leave it there for now. So I think the summary is, let's start with MFA on the admins. Let's get, a little bit of a vault set up, start with some core systems, and then, like you said, land and expand, move from there, generate, if you can, some metrics to drive awareness around the effectiveness of what you're doing and try to get more budget that way.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we'll call it for today, and thank everyone for listening, and we'll talk to you down the road. Thanks all.